And will you stand with me as we read? Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice cries, in the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. A voice says, cry. And I said, what shall I cry? All flesh is grass, and all its beauty is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, when the breath of the Lord blows on it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. Go on up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good news. Lift up your voice with strength, O Jerusalem, herald of good news. Lift it up, fear not. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. Behold, the Lord God comes with might, and his arm rules for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. He will tend his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom, and gently lead those that are with young. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and marked off the heavens with a span, enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales, and the hills in a balance? Who has measured the Spirit of the Lord, or what man shows him his counsel? Whom did he consult, and who made him understand? Who taught him the path of justice, and taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding? Behold, the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and are accounted as the dust on the scales. Behold, he takes up the coastlands like fine dust. Lebanon would not suffice for fuel, nor are its beasts enough for a burnt offering. All the nations are as nothing before him. They are accounted by him as less than nothing and emptiness. To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness compare with him? An idol? A craftsman casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold and casts for it silver chains. Excuse me. He who is too impoverished for an offering chooses wood that will not rot. He seeks out a skillful craftsman to set up an idol that will not move. Do you not know? Do you not hear? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, spreads them like a tent to dwell in, who brings princes to nothing and makes the rulers of the earth as emptiness. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows on them and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. To whom then will you compare me, that I should be like him, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes on high and see. Who created these? He who brings out their host by number, calling them all by name, by the greatness of his might, and because he is strong in power, not one is missing. So why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, that my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. There is a repeated emphasis on proclamation throughout this chapter. Verse 1, comfort, comfort my people. That's a message given to us to share. Verse 2, speak tenderly, cry to her. Verse 3, a voice cries. Verse 6, a voice says, cry. Verse 9, go on up to a high mountain, herald of good news. Lift up your voice with strength, herald of good news. Lift it up, fear not. And what is to be heralded is the rest of the chapter. John Oswalt says of this emphasis on proclamation, he says, quote, this good news, meaning the entirety of Isaiah 40, must be spoken, announced, proclaimed. God has spoken, and who can keep silent? Indeed, within Isaiah chapters 40 through 66, which is often seen as a single unit, the verb to call and proclaim occurs more than 30 times throughout it. And who is deputized, commissioned, great commissioned, we might add, to indeed comfort, speak, cry, lift up their voice with strength, and herald the good news? People. People are. Now that may sound obvious and quite unprofound, but in our day and age, I assure you it is not. We have so internalized that effective communication mechanisms are disembodied, and we have done so to such an extent that we're largely not even aware of it. Like we're not aware of actively breathing. It's become that normative to us. But just ask yourself, to the question, how does something get communicated? And how long the list do you have to go until your answer is people? And why, for such a seemingly obvious answer, does it take that long down the list to get to it? Here's how our assumptions and the spirit of our age would rewrite Isaiah chapter 40. Verse 1, comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Make a compelling post on Facebook. Invite them to a worship service where it will then be communicated that warfare is ended, iniquity pardoned. Verse 3, my church's promotional material states, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Verse 6, their Instagram says, cry. And my comment on their post said, what shall I cry? And they responded the next day, but I didn't see it until the following because I'd forgotten to go back and look. Anyway, they said, all flesh is grass. Verse 9, find a background of a mountain, O social media creator. Pick a strong font and a wintry filter. Slightly blur the background and put this text in the center. Behold your God. And to the well-known passage in Romans 10, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without a 4K, multi-angle, theatrically lit, expertly filmed sermon video? And how is the 4K, multi-angle, theatrically lit, expertly filmed sermon video to be useful unless it is liked and shared on Facebook? As it is written, how beautiful are the posts of those who retweet good news. There is the enormous and enormously consequential topic of life in the digital sphere. A disembodied life. Its alleged benefits and yet the demonstrable havoc it has wreaked and continues to wreak. And we will only brush that in this sermon, but we'll look at it in depth over a sustained period of time this year. But one of its facets does relate to this sermon, and that is when we think of effective communication, we largely, if not entirely, think digital communication. You name it, website, social media, email, etc. And we obviously understand why. And it's not as if any of that is intrinsically wrong or ineffective or evil. We have a pretty good sense of its benefits. Now, I'm not sure we have an equal sense of some unintended consequences. Perhaps the most being the effect it has had on you. Now just put a marker and hold that thought. So to the question, how are folks going to know about fill in the blank? Many of us mean by that question, how will it be promoted? And we probably mean, how will it be promoted digitally, on the website, on social media, on email, etc. But there's another element to this, because this question is often asked to ministers. You're probably not asking that question to the person next to you in the pew. How will this be communicated? And that's because to the question, how are folks going to know about fill in the blank? Not only do we mean, how will it be promoted? We mean, how will it be promoted by the church? Now, ironically, half of that is a great question. Indeed, how will it be promoted by the church? Seeing as the church is, you guessed it, you. But what we mean by the church is, how will staff on digital platforms promote and communicate what is going on? How will folks know about fill in the blank usually means, how is the church going to promote this digitally? Now, to be fair, this sort of disempowering of the person, a disempowering of you, and shifting the focus and attention to the church, and we do have to put that in quotation marks, it is not entirely, not even primarily, the fault of people. It's been one that church leadership for decades has gladly but mistakenly grabbed the baton and run with. Way back when, we knew as church-going folk, we certainly knew it as Baptists, that there was no substitute for a personal invitation. That's why, as I'm sure was here at some point, some of you likely remember, there were strong outreach committees. Now, growing up as a child, the only committees I even remember being aware of were personnel, finance, and outreach. That's all I remember being aware of. Outreach was number one, prioritized, was highly prioritized, and number two, it was understood that it was most effective at the person-to-person level. Now, David Wachter and his family, they have been here for 21 years. And why is that? Because David Moore and another gentleman showed up at their house after they visited our church 21 years ago. Now, you think of all the Wachters have meant to our church family, and that's only because two people, that's all it took outreach seriously. But then the attractional church model became the norm. And then outreach was outsourced from people and placed instead on the church as this sort of singular entity. And it's not pertinent to this sermon. the effects of that tectonic shift, and, to extend the metaphor, the earthquakes that happened, well-intended, but with profoundly deleterious effects, with its emphasis then on facilities and programs and perks, like churches were universities competing for recruits. How all metrics for success became based then in those things, in attendance and facilities and programs and perks. None of them bad or evil, but neither with one sentence from Jesus as to their being used to judge the health of his church. He, the unglamorous crucified Lord. But pertinent to this sermon is that the product of the church, primarily its worship service, became the assumed magnet of what will get people here. It's about what happens in the worship service. And so all this to say, it is no surprise that decades of that paradigm, at this point almost half a century, shifting the focus from the people to the product, to the organization, has unconsciously formed church-going folk to ask the question, how are folks going to know about fill in the blank? And mean by that, how is the church going to promote it? And add on top of that, removing yourself entirely out of that equation. And in the last decade-ish, really mean by that, how's the church going to promote it digitally? The most impersonal and disembodied of communication. Isaiah 40 knows better. The message, the voices, the heralds of truth, the voices lifted up with strength, they are not outsourced to platforms. They are the commands and callings and commissions of God's people. We as church staff, we will indeed work this year at bettering communication mechanisms, analog and digital. This isn't about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But Isaiah 40 declares what all of Scripture declares, and that is that people are to be the means of the proliferation of God's good news. And the thing is, Isaiah knows what we all know when we think about it. And an interesting experience happened when Laura, Luke, and I first got here. It was in those first few months, and the Palmer Sunday School class had a fellowship at Stephen Tracy's house, that we were invited to. After eating, as a way of welcoming and introduction, those that were there were invited to say who they were and how they came to First Baptist so that they could introduce themselves to us. And a lot of people participated, some of whom you're here. And let me tell you what was not mentioned once in anyone's story. A song, a sermon, an event, a lesson, a flyer, a post, an article, not once. You want to know what was mentioned? People. People who introduced themselves to them when they visited. People who ate lunch with them after they visited. People who became friends. And I interrupted sometime in the midst of this to draw attention to that fact, that all the things that we think why folks plant themselves and their families at a church, no one had mentioned a single element of a service or a lesson or sermon or an event. Why people had come and why people had stayed, as you all know, through thick and thin, was because of friends. It was because of people. People who loved them, people who prayed with them, people who extended hospitality to them, people they worshiped with, people who had invited them. And we all could tell a version of that story. That this isn't complicated. And this was in 2019. After 22 months of our worlds being turned upside down, isolated from friends and family, with all sorts of mechanisms in place to promote and sustain that isolation, has the importance of people, of human connection, ever in our lifetimes been greater? Anyone else need more commercials in their life? More ads? More promos? More emails asking for this, asking for that? Do you need another list of events forwarded to you? Are you meticulously reading and watching and paying attention to all of those that bombard your life right now? Are you interested at all in them? Or do you silence them as fast as possible? Mute the TV. Unsubscribe from the email list. Delete the email based solely on the subject line. Ignore them altogether. Find that little X wherever it's hiding in the ad that just popped up on your screen and won't go away. I think we're pretty maxed out on digital, impersonal communication. I don't get the feeling we're maxed out on friendship, on human connection, on conversations without an agenda, on laughter with friends, on dinner in the backyard, on knowing people and being known. I think we're pretty minimumed on that one. We just celebrated Christmas, the birth of Jesus. And don't overlook the fact that indeed God's eternal answer to the world's condition was not a message, but a person. A person who embodied a message and who sent that message out, not with the invention of the printing press or the internet, but with spirit-empowered people. That was God's plan. The communicator of God's good news was a person who then commissioned people. And that's still the case. For your family, for your friends, for your actual neighbors, for your co-workers, for acquaintances that you meet, the most effective means of communication to that person is you. The most powerful means of invitation will come from you. You all know by now that I don't see attendance as some intrinsic indicator of success. Nor does Jesus or Scripture, by the way, other than that. But for whatever it is worth, there is no church growth strategy that holds a candle to personal invitation. If everyone in this room brought one person with them to church next week, that's all you had to do, bring one person. If everyone did that, we would instantly double. And if everyone did it again, we would have to have multiple services because of capacity. So exceeding the capacity of this beautiful, big sanctuary would only take 2 weeks of that strategy invite and bring one person. Indeed, if everyone in this room only had that as your church goal for 2022, invite, bring, and unite one person to our church family, we would double by year's end. You see what I'm saying? Nothing. No silly, slick marketing campaign is more effective than that. So Isaiah 40 calls us to go on up to a high mountain. We can't do that, but we can go tell it in the foothills. You can go tell it in the foothills. Tell of God's transcendence. Tell of his good shepherd eminence. Tell that there is no substitute, no alternative to life in him. Tell that no one is hidden from him. Tell that no one is forgotten by him. Tell that the resources and strength and peace and joy and forgiveness and love of all of eternity is offered to them in Jesus. Instagram can't do that, and flyers can't do that, newspapers can't do that, our website can't do that, Facebook can't do that, but guess who can? So I ask you, things will be happening at our church this coming year, that I assure you. Things in response to the unsearchable riches of Jesus Christ. And how are folks going to know about it?